Life Stories brings you heartwarming tales of courage, kindness, and unexpected connections. Today's story begins on a quiet countryside road, where a young boy's extraordinary bravery changes the life of a wealthy businessman forever. When Jack Mitchell, a city man consumed by work, is bitten by a venomous snake, it is Ethan, a humble boy from a small Kansas town, who steps in to save him. What follows is a journey of gratitude, growth, and the profound impact of selfless acts. Subscribe to Life Stories to start this incredible tale and discover how one act of courage can transform lives. The Kansas countryside stretched endlessly under the golden light of the late afternoon sun. The wheat fields swayed gently in the breeze, their vibrant stalks seeming to dance in rhythm with nature itself. Jack Mitchell, a man whose life had been consumed by the relentless pace of business and city living, found himself drawn to the serenity of this rural escape. The hum of his luxury car ceased as he parked it along the dirt road, stepping out in search of a quiet moment to clear his mind. Jack's shoes crunched against the gravel as he walked toward the edge of a wheat field. He had come here impulsively, driven by the suffocating weight of contracts, deadlines, and unending calls that had left him drained. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and ceaseless energy, felt like a cage. Out here, he thought, maybe he could breathe. As he walked, he inhaled deeply, the scent of wild grass and earth filling his lungs. For the first time in weeks, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "How long has it been since I stopped to just exist?" he murmured to himself. But before he could answer his own question, a sudden, sharp pain shot through his ankle. "Ah!" Jack cried out, stumbling backward. His eyes darted downward, catching a fleeting glimpse of a small brown snake slithering into the tall grass. 2 red puncture marks on his skin stood out vividly, and his heart began to race. For a moment, Jack froze, the world around him falling into silence. He knew he had been bitten by a snake, likely venomous, but panic threatened to overwhelm his thoughts. He struggled to remember the survival tips he'd read in passing somewhere: stay calm, don't move too much, keep the venom from spreading. But those words were far easier to recall than to follow. Fumbling for his phone, Jack's hope sank when the screen displayed no service. His mind raced as he turned toward his car, only a short distance away. Yet every step he took sent waves of pain through his leg, which was rapidly beginning to feel numb. His breath quickened as he staggered forward, willing himself to keep moving. But it was no use. Within moments, his strength gave out, and he sank to the ground. "Help!" he shouted into the stillness, his voice trembling with desperation. But the open fields offered no response. The breeze rustled the wheat. The sky remained achingly vast, and Jack felt utterly alone. A cold sweat broke out on his face as his vision began to blur. Then, faintly, a sound. Footsteps. Light but purposeful. Jack opened his eyes, straining to see through the fading light of the sunset. A figure emerged in the distance, moving toward him. It was small, likely a child, he thought, but as the figure came closer, Jack saw it was a boy, no older than 14. His messy brown hair fell over intelligent, determined eyes, and his clothes, a worn t-shirt and jeans, spoke of a life lived simply. "Are you okay?" the boy called out, his voice steady despite the urgency in his steps. Jack tried to speak but could only manage a weak whisper. Snake bite," he stammered, pointing to his ankle. The boy knelt beside him, his expression calm but focused. "You've been bitten by a snake," he said, assessing the wound with careful eyes. "We need to act quickly." Jack wanted to ask questions: who was this boy? And how could he possibly help? But his body refused to cooperate. The venom was taking hold, and even speaking felt like an impossible effort. He managed a single question, his voice barely audible. Who are you?" "My name's Ethan," the boy replied. "My dad was a medic. I know what to do. Stay still. And trust me." Jack's mind was clouded with doubt. Trust a child? He had built his life on meticulous calculations. Risks weighed against potential rewards. Trust wasn't something he offered lightly, let alone to a boy who appeared to have just come from some countryside adventure. But as Ethan began tying a handkerchief tightly above the wound, his small hands steady and confident, Jack realized he had no choice. "Don't move your leg," Ethan instructed, his voice carrying an authority that belied his age. "The venom will spread faster if the blood circulation increases." He twisted the makeshift tourniquet with a stick he'd found nearby, tightening it to slow the flow of venom. Jack groaned in pain, his body drenched in sweat. But Ethan didn't waver. "You have to stay awake," Ethan said firmly, shaking Jack's shoulder when he saw his eyes beginning to close. "I'll help you. But you have to fight." Jack wanted to protest, to tell Ethan that the pain was unbearable, that he couldn't do it. But something about the boy's resolve sparked a flicker of hope in him. This child, with no tools or backup, was taking charge of a situation most adults would crumble under. In the fragile moment between life and death, Jack's survival rested entirely in the hands of a boy whose courage shone brighter than the setting sun. As Jack's vision blurred further, he felt Ethan adjust his posture, placing his leg lower than his heart. "Where did you learn this?" Jack managed to ask weakly. "My dad taught me," Ethan replied. "But I've never had to deal with a venomous snake before." "Don't worry, I won't let you die." Jack couldn't respond. His body was failing him. But he clung to Ethan's voice, steady and unrelenting. And as the darkness of night began to envelop them, Jack realized that the most unexpected of saviors had arrived. And with him, a chance at life. Ethan's eyes darted around the dimming countryside as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the wheat fields. The air was growing colder, and Jack's condition was deteriorating quickly. The boy knew that time was against them. But giving up wasn't an option. His father had always said, "When someone's life is in your hands, hesitation can be fatal." Jack's breaths were shallow, and his skin had taken on a pale, clammy sheen. "Stay with me," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. "You can't fall asleep. Do you hear me?" Jack gave a faint nod, though his eyelids drooped, and his body seemed heavier with each passing moment. Ethan tightened the tourniquet on Jack's leg, glancing down to check the bite wound. The venom's effects were spreading, evident in the swelling and discoloration. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he worked, but he steeled himself. This wasn't the time for fear. Reaching into his small canvas bag, Ethan pulled out a worn water bottle. He poured a small amount over the wound, carefully cleaning the area with a cloth. "I can't let this get worse," he murmured, more to himself than to Jack. He felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, but it only made his resolve stronger. Jack's weak voice broke through the quiet. Why are you doing this? I'm just a stranger." Ethan paused, glancing up at the man who seemed so fragile now compared to the confident businessman he likely was. "Out here, we don't think about who deserves help," Ethan said simply. "If I don't help you, who will?" Those words struck something deep within Jack, who had spent his life navigating a world of transactions and self-interest. Here was a boy, barely a teenager, risking his safety and exhausting himself for someone he didn't even know. The thought humbled him. But before he could respond, Ethan was already moving. Ethan stood and adjusted the strap of his small bag across his shoulder. "We need to get to help," he said, his tone decisive. "There's no time to wait here." He crouched next to Jack, gripping him under the arms. "I'm going to carry you." Jack's eyes widened in disbelief. You're just a kid." "I'm too heavy." Ethan didn't waver. "It doesn't matter," he said firmly. "Just don't move too much." With a deep breath, Ethan hoisted Jack onto his back, staggering slightly under the man's weight but refusing to falter. Jack felt the boy's thin frame beneath him, every step an enormous effort. The ground was uneven, and the cool night air chilled them both. But Ethan pressed on, his steps resolute. As they trudged along the dirt path, Jack could hear Ethan's labored breaths and the crunch of his worn shoes against the gravel. The boy's determination was palpable, and Jack couldn't help but feel a pang of admiration. "You don't have to do this," Jack whispered weakly. "Yes, I do," Ethan replied without hesitation. "You're not just a stranger. Out here, we only have each other." The words hung in the air, a profound reminder of human connection in its rawest form. Jack's usual cynicism about people began to melt away, replaced by a deep respect for this boy who carried him through the night, both literally and figuratively. The journey was grueling. Sweat dripped down Ethan's face, and his legs trembled under the strain. The biting wind whipped through the fields. But he didn't stop. Each step seemed heavier than the last. But Ethan kept his focus on the distant horizon. His thoughts were simple: I have to save him. Darkness enveloped them entirely, the moon casting a faint silver glow on the fields. Jack's weight pressed harder against Ethan's back, and he began to feel the limits of his strength. But even as exhaustion clawed at him, Ethan muttered words of encouragement, both for himself and for Jack. "Just a little further. We'll make it." Jack, despite his pain and fatigue, managed a faint smile. "You're stubborn," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'm grateful for it." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't afford to lose focus. Ahead, a faint glimmer of light appeared on the horizon, sparking a surge of hope. He exhaled shakily, his determination unwavering. "We're almost there," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with both relief and exhaustion. As they pressed on, Jack felt something he hadn't in years, a sense of humility and gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. He clung to Ethan's words, the boy's courage and kindness lighting a spark within him that even the venom couldn't extinguish. Ethan's breaths came in sharp gasps as he trudged forward, the faint light ahead growing slightly brighter with every step. It was a distant house, its windows casting a soft glow in the darkness. Though it wasn't the medical station he'd hoped for, it was something, a potential place for help. But as Ethan drew closer, he hesitated. If the house belonged to a farming family, they might not have the resources or knowledge to handle the emergency. Every second mattered, and stopping here could waste precious time. Jack's weak voice broke through the stillness. "Why did you stop?" Ethan adjusted his grip on Jack's weight and shook his head, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "We're moving on. The station's not far now." He turned away from the light, retracing his mental map of the area. A few kilometers ahead, he remembered seeing a road sign that might lead to the medical station. Ethan's legs burned with each step, his thin frame barely managing under Jack's weight. But his resolve remained unshaken. The cold night air bit at his skin, and the uneven road seemed determined to trip him with every step. Jack groaned softly, his voice faint. "You can't do this. Put me down. Save yourself." Ethan stopped abruptly, setting his jaw. He turned his head just enough to glance at Jack. "No. I told you I'm not leaving you. If you say that again, I'm not listening." There was a finality to his words that silenced Jack. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless yet deeply cared for in a way he had never experienced. The boy's determination was like an anchor, keeping him tethered to hope even as the venom pulled him toward unconsciousness. The distant hum of an engine suddenly cut through the quiet night. Ethan's head snapped up, his eyes widening in relief. "A car!" he exclaimed, his voice breaking with urgency. Carefully, he lowered Jack onto the ground, propping him against a nearby tree. "Stay here. Don't move," Ethan said, his tone more commanding than ever. Jack nodded weakly, watching as the boy sprinted into the middle of the road. Ethan waved his arms frantically, shouting into the darkness, "Help! Stop! Please!" At first, the car didn't slow, its headlights blinding Ethan as it approached. Desperation clawed at him as he waved harder, his voice hoarse from yelling. Finally, the vehicle screeched to a halt, its engine rumbling softly in the still night. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weathered face, stepped out, his expression a mix of surprise and concern. "What's going on, kid? What are you doing out here?" the man asked, his voice heavy with curiosity. Ethan pointed toward Jack, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He's been bitten by a venomous snake. I need to get him to a medical station now." The man's gaze shifted to Jack, who lay motionless against the tree. Without hesitation, he nodded. "All right. Let's get him in the car." Together, they lifted Jack into the back seat, Ethan climbing in after him. The car sped off down the dirt road, its headlights slicing through the darkness. Ethan sat beside Jack, his hands trembling as he checked the man's breathing and pulse. "Stay awake," Ethan whispered urgently, shaking Jack's shoulder. "We're almost there." Jack's eyes fluttered open briefly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're remarkable, kid." Ethan's throat tightened, but he shook his head. "Save your strength. Don't talk." The driver glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. "You're doing great, son. Keep him awake. We'll get there soon." Ethan didn't respond, his focus entirely on Jack. He gripped the man's hand tightly, as if his sheer willpower alone could keep him alive. The lights of the medical station finally came into view, and a wave of relief crashed over Ethan. "There it is," he shouted, his voice breaking with emotion. "We made it." The car screeched to a halt outside the small building. Medical staff rushed out, their faces calm but urgent as they assessed the situation. Jack was carefully lifted onto a stretcher and wheeled inside, the doors swinging shut behind him. Ethan stood frozen, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. The driver placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice kind. "You've done everything you could. Let them take it from here." Ethan nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the closed doors. He couldn't rest. Not yet. Not until he knew Jack was safe. Ethan sank into one of the cold plastic chairs in the waiting area, his legs trembling from exhaustion. The adrenaline that had fueled his every step was ebbing, replaced by a dull ache in his muscles and a gnawing worry in his chest. He stared at the emergency room doors, his hands clasped tightly between his knees. The muffled sounds of medical staff working behind those doors were a constant reminder of the fragile line between life and death. The driver sat next to him, his expression a mix of admiration and concern. "You've got a lot of courage, kid," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Not many people would do what you just did." Ethan shook his head, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I just did what I had to," he murmured. "I couldn't leave him there." The driver nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Still, you saved his life. That's no small thing." Ethan didn't respond, his mind racing with thoughts of Jack. Every minute felt like an eternity, the ticking clock on the wall a cruel reminder of how slowly time moved in moments like this. He replayed the journey in his head, the snake bite, the long trek through the fields, the desperation of waving down the car. It all felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Finally, the emergency room doors opened, and a doctor stepped out, his face calm but serious. Ethan jumped to his feet, his heart pounding. "How is he?" he asked, his voice trembling. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We've stabilized him," he said. "Thanks to your quick actions. We were able to administer the antivenom in time. If you'd been even a little later, it might have been a different story." Ethan exhaled shakily, relief flooding through him. His shoulders slumped as the tension he'd been carrying finally began to lift. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice barely audible. The doctor smiled. "No thank you. You saved his life, Ethan." The boy nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He glanced back at the driver, who gave him an encouraging nod. "See, You did it, the man said. Ethan turned back to the doctor. Can I see him? The doctor hesitated for a moment before nodding. He's resting now. But you can go in for a few minutes. Ethan followed the doctor into the quiet room where Jack lay. His eyes closed and his breathing steady. The machines around him beeped softly, a steady rhythm that filled the space with a sense of calm. Ethan stood at the edge of the bed, watching the man who only hours ago had been on the brink of death. Jack's eyes fluttered open, and he blinked a few times before focusing on Ethan. A faint smile spread across his face. You're still here, he said, his voice weak but warm. Ethan nodded, his hands stuffed awkwardly into his pockets. I wanted to make sure you were okay. Jack chuckled softly, though it was more of a wheeze. You're one remarkable kid. You know that. Ethan looked down, his face flushing slightly. I just couldn't leave you out there. Jack's smile grew, though his eyelids drooped with exhaustion. You saved my life, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll never forget that. Ethan didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded. After a moment, the doctor gently touched his shoulder. Let him rest now, he said quietly. Ethan gave Jack one last look before turning to leave. As he stepped back into the waiting area, the weight of the night began to settle on him fully. He felt drained, physically and emotionally, but also strangely content. He had done everything he could, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that it had been enough. The driver stood and walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Come on, kid. Let's get you home. Ethan nodded, the thought of his small, quiet house suddenly comforting. He glanced back at the emergency room doors one last time before following the man outside. The night air was cool against his skin, and as they walked toward the car, Ethan felt a faint flicker of pride amidst the exhaustion. He had done what was right, and for that, he was grateful. The drive back to Ethan's home was quiet, the hum of the car's engine blending with the soft rustling of the wind outside. Ethan leaned his head against the window, watching the darkened fields pass by. The adrenaline had fully worn off, leaving him bone-tired, but his thoughts lingered on Jack. The man's gratitude, the look in his eyes, it wasn't something Ethan was used to. In his small Kansas town, people helped each other because it was simply the right thing to do, not for thanks or recognition. Yet Jack's words had stirred something deep within him. The driver glanced at Ethan in the rearview mirror. You all right back there? Ethan blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. Yeah, just tired. The man nodded. I don't blame you. What you did tonight, it was incredible. Most adults wouldn't have had the guts to do what you did. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I just did what anyone would have done, he said quietly. The driver chuckled, shaking his head. Maybe where you're from, but not everyone's willing to go that far for a stranger. Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't sure how to explain that he didn't see Jack as a stranger anymore. In those harrowing hours, carrying the man through the fields, Ethan had felt an unspoken bond form, a connection forged not by words but by sheer determination to keep someone else alive. When the car finally pulled up to Ethan's house, the familiar sight of the small, weathered farmhouse brought a wave of comfort. The porch light flickered faintly, a beacon in the dark. Ethan's mother appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of worry and relief as she saw him step out of the car. Ethan, she called, rushing down the steps. Are you all right? Where have you been? Ethan nodded, offering a tired smile. I'm fine. Mom. There was an emergency. I'll explain. The driver stepped out as well, extending a hand to Ethan's mother. Your son's a hero, he said warmly. He saved a man's life tonight. Her eyes widened in shock, and she looked back at Ethan, who shifted under her gaze. It wasn't just me, he mumbled. The driver helped too. The man laughed. Don't let him fool you. He carried that man for miles before I even got there. You've got one incredible kid here. Ethan's mother pulled him into a tight embrace, her voice trembling. I'm so proud of you. But, Ethan, you can't just put yourself in danger like that. He returned her hug, his voice soft. I had to. Mom. He needed help. The driver watched the exchange with a smile before stepping back toward his car. I'll leave you two to it. Take care, Ethan. And keep being the remarkable young man you are. Ethan waved as the car disappeared down the dirt road, the taillights fading into the night. His mother led him inside, where the warmth of their small home wrapped around him like a blanket. The familiar creak of the wooden floorboards and the soft glow of the kitchen lamp felt like a balm after the night's chaos. As they sat down at the kitchen table, Ethan recounted the events of the evening. His mother listened intently, her expression shifting between pride and worry. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. You've got a good heart, she said, her voice full of emotion. Your father would be so proud of you. Ethan's throat tightened at the mention of his father, whose teachings had guided him through the ordeal. I just did what he would have done, he said quietly. His mother nodded, her eyes glistening. And that's exactly why he'd be proud. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, his body aching but his heart full, he thought about Jack. The man had seemed larger than life at first, someone so far removed from Ethan's world. But in the end, they weren't so different. Out there in the fields, titles and wealth hadn't mattered. It was just two people, one fighting to save the other. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan carried with him the unshakable belief that sometimes, the smallest acts of courage could change lives in ways no one could predict. The following days passed quietly in Ethan's small farmhouse, but the events of that night lingered in his mind. He returned to his routines, helping his mother with chores and occasionally wandering the fields that had become so familiar to him. Yet, his thoughts often drifted to Jack. Had he fully recovered? Would he even remember the boy who had carried him through the darkened roads? Ethan didn't dwell on it too much. His father had always said, kindness isn't about being remembered. It's about doing what's right and moving forward. Still, when a sleek black car pulled up outside their house one sunny afternoon, Ethan felt his heart skip a beat. He recognized the man stepping out immediately, Jack Mitchell, now dressed in a sharp suit that contrasted with the rustic surroundings, stood awkwardly in the gravel driveway. His polished shoes crunched against the dirt as he approached the door. Ethan watched from the porch, unsure of what to expect. Ethan, Jack said, his voice warm but tentative. I hope I'm not intruding. Ethan's mother appeared behind him, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes flicked between her son and the man who had just arrived. You're the man my boy helped, she said, her tone polite but cautious. Jack nodded, his gaze earnest. Yes. Your son saved my life. I'm here to thank him properly. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. I was just doing what anyone would have done, he muttered. Jack's expression softened. Maybe where you're from. But not everyone would have gone to the lengths you did. You didn't just save me, you carried me when I couldn't go on. That's not something I can forget. Ethan's mother gestured for Jack to come inside, and he stepped into the modest home. The contrast between Jack's tailored appearance and the humble interior was stark. But he didn't seem to notice. His focus remained on Ethan and his mother, his gratitude palpable. They sat around the small kitchen table, where Jack shared more about himself. He explained how his life had revolved around his business in Denver, leaving little time for reflection or connection. That night changed me, Jack admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. It made me realize how fragile life is, and how much I've taken for granted. Ethan listened quietly, his hands clasped in his lap. Jack's words resonated with him, though he couldn't fully grasp the complexities of the man's world. What he did understand, however, was the sincerity in Jack's voice. I don't want to repay you with money or gifts, Jack continued, glancing at Ethan's mother. But I would like to support Ethan in any way I can. He's an extraordinary young man. and I want to make sure he has every opportunity to succeed." Ethan's mother frowned slightly, her protective instincts surfacing. "We live simply, Mr. Mitchell. We don't need charity." Jack shook his head. "This isn't charity. It's gratitude. I believe Ethan has the potential to do great things, and I want to help him achieve that." The room fell silent as Ethan's mother considered Jack's words. Finally, she sighed, her gaze softening as it landed on her son. "If you truly want to help, it has to be for his future, not for us. And it has to come with no strings attached." Jack smiled, relief washing over his features. "That's all I want." As the conversation continued, Ethan remained quiet, his mind racing. He hadn't expected anything from Jack, he never had. But the idea of someone believing in his potential, someone willing to invest in his dreams, was both humbling and exciting. He glanced at his mother, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Jack left that day with a promise to return. But more importantly, he left a spark of possibility in Ethan's heart. For the first time, Ethan began to imagine a future beyond the fields and dirt roads of his small town, a future where his courage and determination might lead him to places he had only dreamed of. As the months passed, Ethan and Jack formed a bond that neither had expected. Jack kept his promise, supporting Ethan's education and encouraging his growth. Under Jack's mentorship, Ethan excelled, his determination and resilience shining brighter than ever. The two became more than benefactor and beneficiary, they became family. Ethan's journey from a humble boy in a small Kansas town to a young man full of promise was a testament to the power of courage, kindness, and human connection. Jack, in turn, found a new purpose in life, realizing that true wealth lies not in material possessions but in the relationships we nurture and the lives we impact. This heartwarming story reminds us that even small acts of bravery and compassion can create ripples that change lives forever. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales that celebrate the beauty of the human spirit.